ask everybody to take your seats, please. We'll get started with dinner. I'm sorry for interrupting conversation, but I will be very, very brief. This is just to welcome everybody here tonight. My name is Josh Rovner. I'm the Interim Director of the Tower Center, and I'm also the Tower Chair in International Politics and National Security here at SMU. Welcome to the Tower Center. Welcome to the Security and Strategy Program here at SMU. I want to give a few thanks before we get going with our program tonight. Thank you to our sponsor tonight, Raytheon, who sponsored this lovely dinner. Thank you very much. Raytheon has been a long-term supporter of the Tower Center. We do appreciate that support greatly. Thanks also to our collaborating partners tonight, the World Affairs Council of Dallas-Fort Worth, the Dallas Committee on Foreign Relations, and the National Defense Industrial Association, who helped in thinking up this event and helping us get our terrific speaker for tonight. I'd like to briefly thank our board members who are with us tonight. Penny Cook, where are you, Penny? Yeah. And Jan Hart-Black. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. Thank you for all you do for the Tower Center. Thanks also to our senior fellows, Tower Center senior fellows who are here. Diana Newton is in the audience somewhere. Thank you for coming, Diana. And Lynn Novak might also be here. Lynn, are you here? Lynn. Very good. I've met a few people so far who've admitted that they've never been to the Tower Center before, which is horrible. It's shocking that you haven't. For the new people who are new to the Tower Center and new to the Security and Strategy Program, a few words on what we do. The Security and Strategy Program focuses on two big questions: how do you win the war, and how do you win the peace? Right? We deal with issues of strategy and of grand strategy. That is, how do you translate military resources into political objectives, and then how do you make a better peace in the aftermath of conflict? What else do? We combine political theory and practical politics in the spirit of Senator Tower, from whom the center is named. Senator Tower was a college professor before he had a long and illustrious career in Congress. And so this center seeks to combine his two passions, his passion for political science and political theory, with the nuts and bolts of the policy world, and in this case, the nuts and bolts of national security policy. The Security and Strategy Program here at the Tower Center is problem-driven. We are not academic. We are not interested in political science solutions or sociology solutions. We're interested in solving real problems. And to do that, you need to cross disciplinary boundaries. I know some things about how the world works. I think I do as a political scientist, but I don't know everything. I need historians on my side. If I want to know about national security, I've got to reach out to engineers. If I want to know about things like nuclear programs, I have to reach out to physicists. And that's what we do here at the center. We bring people together from all across disciplines, from academia, from the policy world, from industry, to try to address big issues like the issues that you'll hear about tonight. Finally, the last thing we do here is we bring lots and lots of speakers. We bring lots and lots of speakers. At the Tower Center this year, we are doing over 40 public events, which means that our staff is amazing. Luisa Del Rosal and June Hume, please give them a round of applause for all they do. They are overworked, but they are appreciated. Believe me, they are. The reason we do this, the reason we bring all these speakers, are two things. One, we're a hub for public conversations about important topics. Right? We want to be one of Dallas's leading centers for these kind of discussions. And the other thing we do is we want to expose students at SMU to the range of things they could become. We want them to meet policymakers, military officers, intelligence professionals, diplomats, academics, think tank analysts, and all the rest. If they're interested in a career in the national security world, they need to have figures to aspire to. And we want to bring them here so that they can meet them and hear from them firsthand. So that's what we do at the Security and Strategy Program here. That's what we do at the Tower Center. If you want to learn more, please come ask me more. Or better yet, join our mailing list and go on our website and see some of the terrific events we are doing this year. I'm going to shut up. We're all going to eat our dinner. I'll be back up here in about 20 or 25 minutes, and I'll introduce tonight's keynote speakers. Please enjoy. Thanks. Good evening again. everybody keep eating, keep enjoying your coffee, keep enjoying your desserts. There's absolutely no rush. I mentioned about 20 minutes ago that here at the Tower Center we like to bring people from all walks of life to deal with issues. We bring politicians and policymakers and academics and journalists and so forth. Well, tonight we're lucky because we have a speaker who has done many things in his life and can speak from a broad range of his own experiences. He can speak from his background as an aviator. He can speak to you from his background as an Air Force officer. He can speak to you as somebody who sat on the Joint Chiefs of Staff as Chief of the National Guard Bureau. And he can speak in his current capacity as the President of NDIA. He has seen the national security world from many different angles, from both inside and out. Most important of all, General McKinley is an SMU graduate. That's it. You didn't have that. General McKinley's talk tonight, as you can see up above, is maintaining the arsenal of democracy. And when we spoke about doing this talk, and we spoke about what he would talk about, he said, I want to talk about the history of the military-industrial complex. And when he used that phrase, I was somewhat taken aback, because that's a loaded phrase for most people. It's sort of a nasty-sounding thing. I don't think it really is. I think it's just, it is what it is. There is a long-standing relationship with the military and the defense industry, right? It's a long and durable relationship, if sometimes difficult. The fact that it's sometimes difficult and contentious is a good thing in a democracy. If everything was smooth sailing all the time, we would probably have an issue. And it's very important to understand how this relationship works, because the tools that we use for national security don't come from nowhere. They don't arrive magically out of thin air. So the history of the relationship is important. It also happens to be fascinating. And both sides of the relationship, both the policy world and the industry world, are dealing with big questions today. Just consider the following three questions, right? Especially with respect to the role of the defense industry. Should the United States focus on non-state actors like ISIS, or should the United States focus in the long term on conventional great powers like China and Russia? Should the United States invest in large traditional weapon systems and platforms, or should it focus on exploiting new technologies, the robotics revolution, unmanned and autonomous systems? Finally, is the budget for research and development and acquisition at risk of being crowded out by other things that we spend for in the defense budget? Personnel, healthcare, and so forth. These are big, weighty questions, but they're important to address head-on, because the answers to these questions will tell us a lot about the future of both the military and the defense industry. Now, it's not fair to expect our speaker to answer all of those questions tonight in the next half an hour, but I'm sure he will give us an awfully good place to start. Please join me in welcoming General Craig Kennedy.
Thank you, Johnson. Great to be with you. Well, it's great to be back on campus, and I think this was the assembly room for my graduation in 1974. We didn't have a lot of graduates back then, but we all ended up in here, and the campus looks great, so all you undergrads and grads, you got to be proud of this campus. It's a beautiful place, and I don't think there's any room left on this campus for any future development, so President Turner deserves a lot of credit for exploiting every bit of real estate and building and having a great endowment, and it is a great university, and I'm so pleased to be back. Thank you, Joshua, for the invitation, and thanks to my National Defense Industrial Association counterparts for standing with me. I was out at Rockwell Collins today and had a wonderful visit. There's so many great companies around this local area. You just draw a map, 50-mile radius around here, and you see so many great companies that have worked so hard, and Raytheon's a sponsor tonight. I can't thank them enough for what they've done. And for all you young people, I'm going to try to walk you through a bit of history tonight. And I know sometimes history's boring, but when Dr. Ovner and I talked about it, it was about where did all this stuff start about the industrial and the military complex? Where did it start? And we got to go back in time. We've got to revisit the 20th century. I spent a little time earlier tonight thinking that we're still kind of living in the 20th century. We're paying the price for the 20th century. And so I hope you indulge me into getting into some prepared remarks, but I'd first like to thank the Tower Center, to Senator John Tower, who was a personal hero of mine. My boss today is Arnold Pinaro. He worked for Senator Sam Nunn. My incoming chair of my board is Sid Ashworth, who worked for Senator Ted Stevens. That's when things got done, folks. That's when politics worked. These were gentlemen who could make a deal, and they compromised. And it wasn't all or nothing. So to the Tower Center and to the family of John Tower, I can't thank you enough for what you do and what you bring to SMU. And for those of you who are too young to remember their great legacy, you need to go online and look it up because they're great people. I had kind of a checkered past here at SMU, and one of the former deans here probably could have taken me out of my game early in the business. As I told President Turner when I was on the stage with Karen Hughes, there's no reason for me to have received the recognition I did from SMU because I really was kind of a negligent student. I hope none of you in this room are, but some of us had an opportunity at our age here to have had a lot of fun and to enjoy the fruits of a four-year college degree. So I hope all those things are resolved now. I hope my picture's not in any of the post offices, and I hope I can continue to get out of town here tomorrow and go back to Washington. So this is a very diverse audience, and it's a great audience. And I think some of my remarks hopefully will resonate, and I would love to get to a point where maybe we can have a little dialogue. I know we have some microphones, so think about questions as I go along, because you can challenge, you can argue with my suppositions here. I will give it to you from the position of having a 38-year military career in the Air Force and about 4,500 hours of time in single-seat jet fighters, flying in a few of our contingencies along the way, and also now in my position as the president of the National Defense Industrial Association. I am not a lobbyist. I didn't want to be a lobbyist when I retired from the Air Force 3 years ago. Lobbyists are good people. We need lobbyists. But I felt like I'd rather be an advocate for the things that our men and women in the military need than lobby for them. So I represent about 1,630 companies. Many of you in this room work for those companies, and they're great companies, and they've been part of our arsenal for democracy throughout the years. So let me take you back a bit in history to when this first started. On December 29, 1940, before Pearl Harbor, President Franklin Roosevelt, who was a great communicator, by the way, took to the airways to deliver one of his famous fireside chats. From the very beginning of the president's comments, it was obvious his subject would be serious and his tone sober. This is not a fireside chat on war, he said. It's a talk on national security, because the nub of the whole purpose of your president is to keep you now and your children later and your grandchildren much later out of a last-ditch war for the preservation of American independence. That's quite a statement. And only Franklin Delano Roosevelt could deliver that before we were involved in the war. The president then stated his major concern. 3 powerful nations, 2 in Europe and 1 in Asia, had joined themselves together in the threat that if the United States of America interfered with or blocked the expansion program of these 3 nations, a program aimed at world control, they would unite in ultimate action against the United States. That's the last real existential threat this nation's ever faced. Existential meaning that had we lost that war, or not been part of that war, we'd probably be speaking a different language in this room tonight. The President was rightfully concerned, for as he spoke, Great Britain, America's closest ally at the time, was under an unrelenting aerial attack that history has labeled the Blitz. Think about this. For 267 days, starting in September of 1940, London and 15 other British cities were attacked relentlessly by Hitler's Luftwaffe. It was a period, as President Kennedy later recalled, of dark days and darker nights where England stood alone, and the whole world, save for the Englishmen, feared for their survival. President Roosevelt was among those who feared a Nazi victory. He had seen firsthand the carnage of World War I and wanted to avoid another American involvement, as did the American people. We were very isolationist prior to the attack on Pearl Harbor. He reassured them, which was his tone, with his plan noting, "The people of Europe who are defending themselves do not ask us to do their fighting. They ask us for the implements of war, the planes, the tanks, the guns, the freighters, which will enable them to fight for their liberty and for our security. Emphatically, we must get these weapons to them, get them to be sufficient in volume and quickly enough so that we and our children will be saved the agony and suffering of the war." He then concluded with the phrase for which this address was noted, "We must be the great arsenal of democracy." So that's where the phrase came from, and that's where we need to revisit ourselves today. President Roosevelt was familiar with the American industrial arsenal. As the Assistant Secretary of the Navy in 1914, he had been present at the New York Naval Shipyard, more commonly known today as the Brooklyn Navy Yard, for the keel laying of the U.S. Navy's newest battleship, the Arizona. Less than a year after his Arsenal of Democracy speech as Commander-in-Chief, he would receive the painful news that the Arizona had been sunk at Pearl Harbor. But after that initial disaster, Roosevelt oversaw the Arsenal of Democracy shift into full gear, led by nearly 40 Army arsenals making small arms and munitions, and by 15 Navy shipyards. Added to these publicly owned and operated facilities were another 39 private companies that shifted their production in lines for the war effort led by Ford Motor Company's Willow Run plant that at its height produced a B-24, think about this, every 55 minutes. Chrysler Corporation that in 4 years produced 40,000 M4 tanks powered by Ford engines, and the Boeing Company that produced nearly 17,000 B-17s. American naval shipyards also shifted into high gear. When the USS Yorktown CVN-5 was sunk at the Battle of Midway in June of 1942, 9 months later, the Japanese fleet found itself confronted with CVN-10, a new, more powerful carrier the Navy had defiantly named the USS Yorktown. That's American ingenuity and productivity. I recount this history for a clear purpose. There was a time when what we now call the Defense Industrial Base was a major presence on the American industrial landscape, where it had demonstrated capacity for expansion and mobilization, and perhaps as important, where it was viewed positively as a key component of the American national security establishment. But those conditions, unfortunately, no longer exist as we once knew them. The public perception, maybe some of you in this room tonight, of the Defense Industrial Base began to change in January 1961, when President Eisenhower delivered his farewell address. Although the President intended this speech to be a general caution against expanded government activity, it was primarily remembered for one sentence and one phrase. In the councils of government, I quote, We must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex. The potential for this disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist," unquote. Pretty strong words for the former Supreme Allied Commander of the United States military. Since that speech, the defense industry has been viewed with suspicion, and its motivations often believed to be dark, perhaps some to be even sinister. Retired Army General Andrew Goodpaster, who was President Eisenhower's closest White House aide as Executive Secretary to the National Security Council, and who played a key role in drafting the farewell address, once commented that he believed Eisenhower would be disappointed to know that the broader message he had intended the speech to convey had been reduced to one enduring phrase. General Goodpaster commented that at one point in the development of the speech, the phrase had been military, industrial, congressional complex. President Eisenhower had removed the word congressional, fearing it might be viewed as a subtle criticism of the new president and vice president, both of whom were coming from the Senate, and one of whom was from Texas, of course. Goodpaster wondered if the phrase would have found such a firm place in the American memory had congressional stayed in, as among other things it might have been too wordy for anyone to easily reconcile. Nonetheless, the phrase military-industrial complex has persisted for over half a century, but the complex to which it refers has not. The image remains of a large, sprawling industry with a major presence in every state, of long assembly lines such as the Willow Run plant, with major military items rolling out of the doors. But quite frankly, for those of you, and I know you know this, the reality is much different. I'll offer you several items putting this in perspective, but let me start with just one piece of data that is as easy to comprehend as it is surprising. The combined, and let me emphasize, combined annual defense review of the top 5 defense firms, Boeing, Lockheed Martin, General Dynamics, Northrop Grumman, and Raytheon, our sponsor tonight, by the way, is 1/3 the annual revenue of Walmart. Think about that in economic terms. Many are surprised to hear that fact. That one data point vividly demonstrates my major message to you tonight. The nation's current military-industrial complex has devolved into essentially a niche business that has greatly contracted since the end of the Cold War in 1991 and continues to this day with sequestration and the Budget Control Act. Allow me to elaborate. Remember, think of your questions, young people. A major metric of success in the business world is to reach the place where your company or corporation makes it onto the annual Fortune 500. Probably some of you have been involved in businesses have been on that august list. As you all know, the listing by revenue of the top 500 companies in the country, and it is an impressive list. In 2015, for example, the 500 companies comprising the list accounted for $12 trillion in annual revenue, which equates to about 2/3 of the U.S. economy. As you're aware, Fortune has published this listing every year for decades, so it serves as a useful frame of reference for the changes that have occurred in the U.S. economy broadly and various industries in specific. Let's begin the examination in 1961 when President Eisenhower delivered his famous speech. As the President noted that evening, following World War II, America's military organization and structure had changed enormously. President Eisenhower noted that until the last of our world conflicts, the United States had no armaments industry. American makers of plowshares, back in our Patriots' day, could with time as required make swords as well. But now we can no longer risk emergency improvisation of national defense, and have been compelled to create a permanent armaments industry of vast proportions. To be clear, what President Eisenhower actually meant in this passage, in my opinion, is that following World War II, the old publicly owned arsenal system had been largely displaced by private companies and corporations producing the highly sophisticated weapons required for Cold War confrontation with the former Soviet Union. It was not the existence of an American arms industry that was different, as much as the fact that much of it had been contracted to the private sector, relieving the government of a major management function and comporting with a major philosophical view held by many that greater efficiencies and innovation would be realized in the private sector, a term that many of our presidential candidates believe is true today. This was clearly a significant change and perhaps partially explained President Eisenhower's choice of experienced industrialists as his first two Secretaries of Defense, Secretary Forrestal to be exact. In the Fortune 500 released in 1961, before many of you in this room were born, by the way, in the top 100 companies there were 16 that had major defense units, with 8 of these companies being almost exclusively focused on the defense market. As a group, these companies accounted for nearly 30% of the top 100's revenue. So they certainly represented a major presence in the national economy. Interestingly, however, as a group, they were operating at a loss. Not an unusual circumstance for a new industry, but obviously one that was not sustainable for all you econ majors. Fast forward to today. In the latest release of the Fortune 500, there were only 11 companies listed as aerospace and defense firms. Within the top 100 companies, there were only 4, with General Dynamics, the largest defense firm in 1961, now holding the 100th slot. The largest aerospace and defense firm in this year was Boeing at number 27, although 2/3 of their revenue comes from commercial aircraft, which we fly every day around the country. United Technologies at number 45, and it just divested its major defense unit, Sikorsky helicopters, to Lockheed Martin. To number 64, Lockheed Martin. Only Lockheed Martin and General Dynamics were basically pure defense firms, defined by us in the industry as those having over 70% of their revenue coming from defense programs. So by this single metric, it's apparent the defense industrial base is shrinking, but there are other indications that suggest the same trend. During the 60s and 70s, we were engaged in a major space race, many of us remember, with the former Soviet Union. And with the launch of Yuri Gagarin in April of '61, the Soviets took a clear lead. But President Kennedy set the goal of decisively regaining that lead and reaching the moon first, and by the end of the 1960s we did. Eventually 9 major aerospace and defense companies joined in the effort. Chrysler Aerospace built the Redstone missile that launched Alan Shepard into space, while McDonnell Aviation built the capsule that carried him. Convair in Fort Worth built the Atlas missile that John Glenn rode to become the first American in orbit. And the Glenn L. Martin Company, not even referred to anymore today, built the Titan missile that was the launch vehicle of the Gemini program. And for the moon landings, a consortium of 4 companies teamed under the leadership of the famous Wernher von Braun to build the mighty Saturn V, which lifted the North American Aviation-produced Apollo Command Module, which orbited overhead while Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin landed on the surface aboard the Lunar Excursion Module built by Grumman. Of all these companies that combined to win the space race, only 2, Boeing and IBM, still exist as independent firms. And only Boeing is still involved in aerospace and defense. Much the same can be said about aircraft manufacturers. In 1981, when President Reagan decided to significantly expand the nation's military capability, there were some 14 companies that could design, manufacture, and field high-performance military aircraft. Today, there are 2.5, with the half being Northrop Grumman, a company that over the past 2 decades has largely moved into defense electronics and high-end surveillance while downshifting its aircraft operation to that of a supplier to others. Northrop, as I suspect many of you recall and know, designed and built the B-2. It was the first big bomber built in stealth, making its transformation away from aircraft quite striking. And as most of you know who are following the trends, Northrop Grumman was awarded the contract to build the long-range strike bomber, and it's under protest by the Boeing consortium. So this inevitably leads to the major question: does it matter? Does any of this matter? I'm certain that you will be stunningly unsurprised that in my role as the President and CEO of the National Defense Industrial Association, I strongly believe it does. And there are many reasons for this conclusion. And I'm almost to the end, so hang with me here. First, as I believe most in this room would agree, the world presently is a very chaotic and unruly place. I don't think I can recall in my 63 years of life any more chaotic or unruly world. We are witnessing daily the unraveling of the post-World War I state structure created in the Middle East, and along with it the end of an American brokered framework of stability that emerged after the 1973 Arab-Israeli War, and the expulsion of the former Soviet forces and advisors from Egypt by President Anwar Sadat. These are names that some of you young people only have read about in the history books. Henry Kissinger recently described this situation well in an op-ed piece last month in the Wall Street Journal. It's quite likely that this endemic instability sweeping the Middle East will be with us for some time to come. God hopefully can change that, but I'm not sure. It has already moved in unexpected ways, and it can be expected that there will be more of the unexpected as we saw today. In such an environment, we must be prepared to respond in many ways, from kinetic to cyber, and we must be prepared to do so quickly. We must also be prepared so that our servicemen and women are equipped with the best available equipment, and that we have the ability to provide appropriate capabilities to our allies, which are fewer in number than we would expect, and partners as needed. Second, we must recognize that we are not alone among those states seeking to enhance their military capabilities and expand their spheres of influence. A senior Singaporean official once commented about the Chinese. They, quote, charm you when they want to charm you and squeeze you when they want to squeeze you, and they do it quite systematically, unquote. It's quite obvious that the Chinese are engaged in a naval buildup and modernization with the idea of eventually preventing the U.S. Navy from getting between the first island chain and the Chinese coast whenever and wherever it wants. Recent Chinese activities in the South China Sea, constructing a chain of artificial islands to lay claim to this potentially resource-rich area, is of concern to our government. We must be cognizant of the fact that Chinese ambitions on its seaward side are not substantially different from those of Japan in the 1930s. Similarly, Russia, under the leadership of Vladimir Putin, is also engaged in a military modernization effort that many find worrisome. It has been suggested that the recent Russian intervention in Syria provides its military with the opportunity to test new systems and tactics, much as the Germans did in 1936 when it intervened in the Spanish Civil War. Sweden's respected former Prime Minister Carl Bildt recently described Russia under President Putin as an unpredictable country which is now on a path that is revisionist, reactionary, and perhaps reckless. I'm not trying to demoralize anybody in this audience, by the way. There's a spectrum of conflict that we all know and recognize, going from high-end state-on-state conflict to lower-level insurgencies. Each is challenging in its own way, and although some technological solutions are common to both, many are not. We must retain the ability to respond to immediate needs and rapidly emerging requirements in whatever domain they appear. In no way am I suggesting that an upper-end conflict is inevitable, but history should teach us that it is not infeasible, and the more capable we are, the less probable it is. Third, in a most major manner, the American way of war has changed. Many of you are veterans in this audience. In World War II, we had 13 million Americans in uniform, about 10% of our population. It was a large force, and we equipped it superbly in some areas, such as aircraft and ships, but crudely in others. In some ways, we accepted lesser capability as we knew our far superior numbers would prevail. As Brad Pitt's recent movie Fury vividly demonstrates, the M4 tank was no match for the German Tiger tank, one-on-one. But as stated earlier, we had 30,000 M4s in Europe, and the Germans had 2,000 Tigers. At some point, the Tiger was going to be out of gas and out of ammunition. But today we have a volunteer army, military of 1.3 million active servicemen and women, and another 800,000 in the Reserve and National Guard. Because our numbers are few, and likely to get fewer still because of budgetary conditions, we rely in the United States on technology to provide the advantage we no longer get from numbers. A World War II infantryman carried about $200 worth of equipment. Today's infantry soldier carries almost $20,000 worth of equipment on their back. In addition, maintaining our superiority in strategic deterrence, strategic mobility, and strategic strike is very expensive and unlikely to become less costly in the future. In short, we've shifted from a large, relatively low-tech force to a much smaller, all-volunteer, high-tech force. The defense industrial base reflects this. Whereas in World War II, the nation produced over 200,000 aircraft, today we annually produce about 200. The same can be said for ships and ground equipment. As one defense industry authority has noted, whereas the defense industry once looked like Ford with long serial production lines, it now looks more like Ferrari with very advanced and expensive items made essentially one at a time. Fourth, and my final point, as it was back in December of 1940, our allies and potential partners simply do not have the broad-based capabilities that we do, despite the significant reductions in our own capacity over the past 25 years. Many have excellent research and development centers, and many are eager to team with American defense companies to gain access to an American defense market that, while greatly reduced, remains much larger than their own. I just recently traveled to Sweden, attending their annual conference of the Swedish Security and Defense Industry Association, and I was able to see firsthand the synergies available through teaming arrangements such as the one between Boeing and Saab on the Air Force's planned new trainer. But I would have to say that just as former Secretary of State Madeleine Albright once described, the United States as the indispensable nation, ours remains the indispensable defense industrial base. In general, the advanced and breakthrough technologies needed by our armed forces in the future will be by necessity American-made. So what needs to be done? There have been, by some counts, nearly 200 reports on the defense acquisition system conducted over the past 5 decades, many saying much the same thing. First, any relationship between a customer and a seller is to some degree tense and adversarial. Certainly any of you who have ever bought a car or a house would recognize that condition. But over the past few years, the relationship between the Defense Department customer and the industry providers has become far too intense, strained, and distant. Both seek the same outcome, albeit for different reasons, and that needs to be recognized. This key relationship must be correct, conversational, and continual. Misunderstandings about requirements or the actual state of technology cause program troubles and must be avoided. I think I saw that a little bit in the Rockwell Collins presentation today. It's tough to do business with the Department of Defense. Second, government needs to understand that defense companies, like all companies in any business, are in it to make a fair return. That's the American way. Making a fair return is not unpatriotic. The perception is that defense companies make a lot of money. The reality is that historically their margins have been well below those of more commercial manufacturing firms. Since 1961, in real terms, constant dollars, companies in the Fortune 100 have seen their earnings grow by over 900%. Defense companies in the Fortune 100 have seen their earnings grow by less than 70%. When we look at shifting technology and interest to Silicon Valley, they're used to 80% margins. Those are consumer venture capitalists who seek a return for their investors. Most of our defense companies normally seek about 8 to 10%. The message here is quite simple. If companies in a market cannot earn what the economists call normal profits, they will exit the market and go somewhere else. Essentially, that is what we recently saw when United Technologies sold Sikorsky, allowing its management to return the proceeds to shareholders in dividends and stock buybacks, and focus more attention on United Technologies Carrier air conditioners and Otis elevators, each having over twice the margins of Sikorsky. If we're going to have a market-based defense industry, we need to understand what market-based actually implies, especially as the number of firms in the market decreases. Lastly, there needs to be a significant reduction in federal contracting rules and regulations. Former Secretary of Defense for Acquisition Logistics, Dr. Jack Gansler, recently stated that over the past decade, defense industry companies had paid over $1 trillion in compliance costs for the 180,000 pages of government rules and regulations. No normal company in a normal market would accept this. Such burdens are disincentives for companies to join the defense market, and simultaneously incentives for those in it to leave, and many have. A senior Air Force acquisition officer once noted that the government had designed a system to ensure nothing bad happens quickly. Unfortunately, it tends to ensure nothing good happens quickly either. This has to change. Given the world situation, the disintegration of some states, and the perceived aggressiveness of others, American national security will increasingly demand an armed forces that is well-trained and well-equipped, ready to deploy anywhere for any mission and succeed. Regrettably driven by a terrible budget situation in Washington, which could be the subject for another speech at a later time, as the demands get larger, our forces are getting smaller. This could mean that, as former Defense Secretary Bill Perry noted in the report of the National Defense Panel, that a future president might face the dilemma of abandoning a vital national interest or sending in forces unprepared to protect it. History is replete with these examples. We must avoid making that mistake. And if our forces get smaller, the only way to compensate any reduced size is through increased capability, newer and better technology. That makes the defense industrial base more important now than ever. We must reconsider how we as a nation, as a society, have come to review and view the defense industrial base. In my personal view, given the current world situation and the numerous and extensive deployments of the past 15 years, we must return to seeing the defense industry as President Roosevelt saw it, the arsenal of democracy, and move beyond the outdated perception of a politically intrusive, sprawling complex that only exists in the history books. Kipling's poem Tommy, which said, "For it's Tommy this and Tommy that, and chuck him out, the brute, but it's savior of this country when the guns begin to shoot." The nation needs a vibrant, innovative, expansible defense industrial base. And to the extent you can, if you believe my figures to be accurate, help us keep one. Thanks, and go Mustangs. We got a little time?
We do have time for a little bit of Q&A. There will be microphones going around, so think of your questions, have your hands up. We have at least one in the back. I'm going to take the prerogative to ask you the first question.
It's a Naval War College professor when I ask this. This could be tough.
Ask about aviation.
Great.
One thing that was fascinating in your talk is the consolidation of the industry, especially in aviation.
Right.
Basically 2.5 firms that can produce these manned aircrafts. I wonder about your thoughts about unmanned systems, right? And what the future looks like for the industry, because, as you say, there's huge barriers to entry for anybody who would want to get in this business for the first time. It's basically impossible, in no small measure because these systems are so complex and so expensive and so detailed, and the supply chains are so extraordinarily long. But what does UAS do about that? Suddenly you have a proliferation of technologies which are much simpler, much less expensive, and which potentially open up opportunities for new firms to get involved in aviation. So just in general, what's your thought about UAS and what that holds for aviation industry?
I think for most of us old-timers who flew and had fun flying airplanes, it was a complete revolution in how we did business. And now that we've all accepted the fact that these are great little machines, they don't expose a person and a woman to risk from enemy air defenses or capture. And we've seen the capability of these machines. Most of my contemporaries younger than me think they're great. Will we ever take the person out of the machine? I use that gender neutrally, because we have a great fighting force of men and women today. There's probably some missions that need a person in the cockpit. But I think the revolution in building small, remotely piloted aircraft is here. I think American industry has brought it to reality. I think the United States Navy is realizing that you could have a carrier with remotely piloted aircraft and not subject those carrier pilots to enemy fires. And the fact that our adversaries have built anti-access area denial weapons, which will make the advent of the aircraft carrier getting in very close to their target almost impossible. I think the remotely piloted aircraft is, for all these young people in here, it's the wave of the future. It's smart, it's less expensive, and it doesn't risk our pilots. So I think it's a great system, and it's a great question. Other thoughts? We'll go here and back here. Another Air Force guy, by the way. You want a microphone? Here.
Thank you, General, and thank you so much for your talk tonight. Scott Chestnut, Rocco Collins, and Air Force retired. I have a Washington, D.C. question for you. Even though history shows a relatively consistent pattern of warfare throughout recorded history, our government seems to have a relatively short memory during interwar periods. Why do you think that is in the U.S. government, and what can we do to mitigate that?
I don't know. There's probably people who can answer that better than me. I don't know why we have short memories. I know that the budgets create tension on the system. I know that we thought at the end of the Cold War, when the Berlin Wall came down, we thought we would have a peace dividend, and President Clinton was able to exploit that time to take some of that money and apply it to some of the social problems that our nation faced. But we seem to go from cycle to cycle, peak to valley, and we have to relive very dangerous historical precedent. So hopefully some of my comments about the interwar years resonated tonight. I think any of you who are studying history need to look at the interwar years between World War I and World War II to see if there aren't some similarities, which is where we are today. My fear is that the next conflict, if it is a large-scale force-on-force conflict, will be unlike anything we have ever planned for. It will probably involve an initial cyber attack, which will affect us here at home very dramatically. It will probably take down our power grids. It will probably involve nuclear or biological or chemical weapons, which will probably take the wind out of the American ability to respond quickly. Those are things that I think are new actors on the stage. And so for all of us who hope and pray we never get there, we need to have the capability to defend the nation against these new types of attack, which may not even be from a state-sponsored entity. It's a tough time we're living in right now. But we look to the John Towers of the world to say, how would we deal with it? And we have to be logical, we have to be thoughtful. The Tower Center looks at this through their speaker series. We shouldn't be ignorant of the fact that there are people and entities in this world that would do us harm. And we just have to protect ourselves the best way we can. Yes, sir, and then we'll go over here. Thanks.
This might be something that you might be able to affect. It seems to me that, you being kind of an old guy, that one of the issues that's caused a lot of the demise of the military capacity here has to do with the American public's attitude regarding what is perceived as terrible waste in the purchase and acquisition of these major systems that we need to have. Would you just comment on what you see being in the industry as to what is the true condition of that and what you all as an organization and that we might be able to do to turn that around?
That's a fantastic question. Obviously, our government is not efficient, which makes it not effective. When we bid these contracts, we don't necessarily get the best value from the contracts. In many cases, cost overruns, long-term business strategies by which we build out a product line over time are not met, and therefore we pay top dollar to programs that may not be as effective as we think they are. In my tenure, I look back on my history. I look at when we were involved in the Cold War, we put products online that we thought would be needed if we ever had a war with the former Soviet Union, which never materialized, thank God. Those programs took 20 to 30 years to bring to fruition, and by the time we built out the programs, the costs had gone up exponentially. I think Americans rightfully have a desire to get the best for their taxpayers' dollar. I think Senator McCain is an example of a person I would say represents us all very well when he talks about the acquisition reform issues that need to take place in this country to avoid the costly overruns and the waste, because certainly there is. Think about a $620 billion a year budget. You'd think we'd be able to accomplish everything we need with that amount of money. Almost half of that goes to personnel and healthcare. About a third of that is left goes to modernization and recapitalization, and the rest is just there for the services to use at their discretion. So I think whatever political candidate you might choose for this next election, it's vital to ensure that they have some knowledge of this issue and how they would bring their military policymakers to bear to get it right, because we definitely need to revise the program. Thank you.
Let's go here and then back. Here. I'll do the pass.
First, again, I want to thank you for coming to Rockwell today. The building was buzzing after you left. We very much enjoyed it.
Thanks.
So my question is going to drill down a little bit and talk about what you were saying, the shrinking industrial base, and also maybe cyber potential attacks. So as you know, IBM recently sold their microelectronics, and now it's a single source of supply from a foreign source for national assets. What are your thoughts on that, and how can we fix that now that that's our only source of supply, which I believe is now in China's hands?
Yeah, I think what I learned today in your area is the fact that, first of all, you may be building some of the only things that you build, and you have to do it at a reasonable profit, and you have 625 workers in that facility when you may have had 1,000 before. You've already leaned out your operation. There's no more real efficiency you can get out of it. And if we don't have you, where are we going to get the wire, the technology? It'll come from a China that doesn't pay its workers nearly what we pay our workers. It's very troublesome to me. So the foreign parts that aren't built to our standards will eventually affect our men and women who serve and use that equipment, because they won't be as reliable. And it's a huge concern. And I think Secretary of Defense Carter, who was a former AT&L, Acquisition Technology Logistics person, Bob Work, who's been the former Undersecretary of the Navy, and Frank Kendall, who's an ATL person, understand this, and they're trying to get it right. But we're now down to sole source production. And so when you think about the industrial base and you think about the small suppliers of the things that you build, they could go out of business tomorrow and we'd be dependent upon foreign sales to fill that void. It's not good. It's troublesome. We need to fix it. So that's my lesson that I learned at your place today, and it was a great visit. Thank you.
Yeah, I think back here.
Yeah, in the middle.
Thank you very much for your presentation. So you made a point which I found very interesting about the decline, the marginalization somewhat of the military-industrial complex. I wanted to know how you can reconcile this history of this relative decline with the skyrocketing military budget of the United States in the post 9/11 era, and also the idea, which is an argument which exists out there in the literature, that whatever is going to happen, the system is always going to ask for more resources because it's always going to denounce more sources of insecurity and to ask for more budgets, etc. Thank you very much.
Yeah, where's your home?
France.
Okay. What was your military budget relative to your GDP? I'm not putting you on the spot, but our allies, and I consider France one of our strong allies, have all, through budget declines, England, France, Germany, our NATO allies have all had to reduce their military budgets. I don't know why we consistently try to make up for those declines in our allies' support of their defense budgets. You've got great military equipment. You've been a great ally to us in our fights against Iraq and Afghanistan. But we've got to balance, as Western thinking countries, how we spend our money. I think America is about run dry. I don't think we're going to get significantly higher budgets for defense. If you saw Rand Paul and Senator Marco Rubio the other night, that was the fight between the two Republicans of will we spend more and go deeper in debt, or will we balance our budget? But I would encourage, and I think as our secretaries of defense and our leaders of our nations have said, how do we, as a consortium of nations, all believing in the same values, try to put a defense mechanism together where one country, not necessarily the United States, spends approximately 2 to 2.5% of their GDP on military. If we did that, I think we could see the end of the high defense budgets in the United States. But right now, our countries don't allow us to do that. Migration into Europe is going to cost a lot of money. So with that money that would have maybe gone to upgrading defense in Europe, now is going to go to bring migrants into the nations, France, Germany, Sweden, Denmark. It's a tough problem. This is not an easy solution, but I think the United States defense budget's about as high as it's going to get for a while. And I think we better get the most value we can for our money. We need to reform our military. I think you're going to see Senator McCain through the Senate Armed Services Committee put forth some reforms in military compensation, retirement. We have one of the most generous retirement systems that are out there today in the United States military. That's a good thing. Those people who have joined under these conditions should be grandfathered, but we need to let young people, who many of them will never serve 20 years in the military, have a way to take a 401k. We need to reform the way we do business. But I take your point that what are we getting for our money? What's it there for? I think our nations who have like minds about this threat need to come together and try to figure this out together. You know, the United States wouldn't be here without France. I always am amazed at going to Yorktown. Can you imagine Washington sending a note to the French fleet in the Caribbean that we're going to have this culminating battle in Yorktown and we need the French fleet to come up and block the British fleet? What do you think the chances are that fleet will get the note and come up and block the Brits at Yorktown and Cornwallis's defeat? I always give the French a great deal of credit that they were our allies when we became a nation. So I'm thinking we're in all this together. Thanks. Yeah. Yes, sir.
This will be our last question, just since now.
No, you're cutting me off.
You are. I hate to be the last question here, but when we talk about the military-industrial complex or the industrial base, we think large-scale industry and so on. But picking up on your earlier comment, how do you deal with the perception that perhaps many of these expenditures are aimed at equipping us to fight the last war and not the future war?
Secretary Rumsfeld and Gates both said it more eloquently than I can, is you fight with the military you have. And I know Secretary Rumsfeld was criticized for that comment, but it's true. You size and equip your force for what you think the threat's going to be. We've been in insurgency and counterinsurgency now for 15 years. For most of you young people, you think that's war. For any of you Vietnam vets in this room, it was a different kind of insurgency. You got to go back to World War II to find the last existential challenge to the United States and the free world. I don't know how you postulate yourself for the next war. I know I testified in front of the 9/11 Commission, in front of former Justice who said to me that we were ignorant of the future, that we had a failure of imagination in the Air Force because we couldn't protect our United States against the attacks of the terrorists on 9/11. That was a pretty hard one to swallow, but he was right. We do have a failure of imagination in our nation. We don't think ahead. That's why I hang around with a lot of people in Washington who think the next challenge to us is a low-yield nuclear weapon blown up over Omaha, which will take down our power grids for over a year. Now that's the worst that could happen to us. We know what happens when the power goes off for a night, a day, a week. North Korea could do that, and why not? If their regime is threatened, why wouldn't they? The other great powers probably, if you could figure out who did it, would not do that. But we have some threats out there. I'm not trying, my wife told me, don't go scare those people. but it's true. I mean, did anybody think that half of our fleet would be sunk on December 7th, 1941? But if you go to Norfolk today, all of our ships are in a row in Norfolk's harbor. So if you block the ability for those ships to get out, you don't have a navy in the Atlantic. We've got to do better. We've got to think that people don't really, other nations have an issue with us and our way of life. And we just got to be prepared. And so my voice is small, but having the Tower Center invite me here to kind of give you all my sense of where we are prepared to fight insurgency. We're not prepared to fight a large-scale peer-to-peer fight right now. But we better be. And that's why I say with prudent leadership, and we've got a chance in the next 12 months to elect a Congress and a president who understand the threats that we face, I think we have an opportunity as citizens to affect that change. But I agree with you. We are fighting the last war. I can't thank you enough, Joshua. Thanks for your time.
Thank you so much. And thank you all.
You're going to dismiss everybody? Go home?